Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I am Brian, and today I'm going to be going over and testing out this new inverter offering from AMPEAK. This is a 3000 watt pure sine inverter, 12 volt, that AMPEAK sent over to the channel to do some testing on it, and I'm going to take a look at it. Now, I did a review on an AMPEAK, a 1200 watt AMPEAK inverter almost a year ago. It was a good inverter, however, the only drawback to that inverter was it was very loud. Almost obnoxiously loud, and there have been quite a few comments on that specific inverter kind of mimicking that same feeling that I had toward it. It was just a very loud inverter, but they claim that this is an upgraded model, so let's just get to testing and see how well this inverter performs. Okay, so just a quick close-up of this inverter. Sorry for the glare, but you can see here on the back we've got our two positive and negative mounting bolts. We've got a little grounding screw down here at the bottom. We've got our intake and outtake cooling fans. Up front, we're gonna have a blue backlit kind of LCD screen that's gonna give us some information that I'll show you when we actually get this thing hooked up to a battery. And then up front, you're gonna get three 20 amp, 120 volt receptacles and a car cigarette style input output and your on off button. And that is it. And you also have a couple of USB-A input output ports, as well as a data cable. So if you can purchase an external switch for this unit and you can plug it in there to the front. I did not have one of those, but that's what that port there is for. They also send out a wrench to attach the battery cables and of course your instruction manual. And they're gonna send you about 24 inches worth of 4-gauge positive and negative battery cables with your copper terminal lugs. These are hydraulically crimped on. So these are decent cables. I don't recommend running up to 250 amps or to that 3000 watts off of these cables, but I'm gonna use these cables for my test to make sure that everything works well that they send with this unit. So like I said, I will be using the cables that they provided. However, I still want to use a fuse. I've got a 200 amp inline fuse. So in order to use this, I just have a little pigtail that I have on my other inverter, but I want to be as safe as I can testing this thing out, so I'm going to go ahead and run that with this cable. Okay, now this is the cable that is supplied with the inverter itself. I'm going to try to get as much surface area of this lug on this fuse as I can because the lug's a little bit big for this fuse holder, but we should be fine for this test. Okay, that is for the positive side, and we're just going to rinse and repeat for the negative side. So that is the inverter wiring, and I'm just going to be using my Redodo little 100 amp hour battery right now. This has a 100 amp BMS. So this BMS is actually going to limit the power of that inverter, but I want to check the sine wave, I want to check the hertz, and all that good stuff. We're going to hook up these cables. Now it's a good idea to get some kind of like little resistor to kind of pre-charge that inverter, because as soon as I were to hook up that negative cable to the negative post, it would inrush a whole bunch of energy into that inverter back here, and that's where you get your sparks. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pre-charge this, because this just limits the amount of energy going into that inverter, is all it does. And no spark. Okay, we're back over here to the work desk. I've got everything set up. I've got my multimeter hooked up into one of the outlets on the front of this inverter. We're going to give it its first cut on here. Okay, and I'll pull you in closer to show you the screen, but right now with no load, 122.3 volts. And let me show you the screen if I can. It's not extremely bright. So hopefully you can tell you've got a battery gauge. I don't know yet how accurate that is. It's got your watt output. It's going to have your voltage output as well, running at 60 hertz, and the battery is sitting at 13.2 volts. So you got quite a bit of information there on the LCD screen if that stuff is accurate, but let's get back on the tripod and run some loads. So let's just start off kind of simple on this thing. So I got about a 300 watt incandescent array over here I'm going to plug in. Okay. So this is showing 275 watts. We did go down to 116.9 volts on this. Up to 117. Now let's just check the sine wave real quick on this load. Okay. Pretty clean sine wave right there. Now again, just around 300 watts. The screen is showing 116 volts, so fairly close, guys. The fans are not running yet, which is good. My older model AMPEAK, the fans would run no matter if it had a load or no load. Just constantly running the internal fans. So far, this is nice. We don't have those crazy loud fans. Now this is a 1500 watt space heater. Now I'm not going to be able to get anywhere near 3000 watts off of this inverter because my battery's only got 100 amp BMS. I'm only running 4 gauge cables, so in order to get 3000 watts or 250 amps, you're going to need at least, in my opinion only, 1/aught cable. 4 gauge I would never run 250 amps through, but let's get this heater plugged in before I cook out here in the garage. And I'm just going to start it at full blast. I'm not going to do any ramping up. So we're on high heat and I'm going to go to max mode. Lights on. The inverter showing 1500 watts, 1800 watts. Fans have still yet to kick on, which is good. 116 volts. My multimeter is actually showing 117, which I'm surprised. I thought that it would drop a little bit, but 1600 watts. Also running the incandescent light bulb array still. Okay, so the fans just kicked on. Let me get my microphone up here. So the fans are still fairly loud, I will say that, but they are not constantly running like the older version was. Okay, well now this is running 1500 watts. Let's check the sine wave on this load. And there's a little bit of dirtiness in there, but overall still a pretty clean sine wave for a budget style inverter like this. And my probe came out. So, there we go. So I'd say that's a pretty clean sine wave for this again. Okay, comfortably running 1600 watts. Okay, I've got my multimeter out of the way. Let's plug in one more smaller heater. Now this is a 500 watt heater. I tell you what guys, it is hot in this garage. Especially with these things going. So let's get this heater cut on. Heater's cut on. We are now right around 2000 watts. Oh, okay. Now, what I'm pretty sure that just happened, it just cut off, is my fuse blew. That's what happened. So out of all of this mess, this did fine, that did fine. My fuse did not hold up. I'm going to let this fuse cool down, and then I'm going to replace it with my last fuse that I have. And then we'll test this out again to make sure that we can get at least this 2000 watts that I have set up here, because again, I don't have the right cabling to really go anything above that. Day number 2. I had to go get some more inline fuses since my 200 amp fuse blew. So now I've got a 250 amp fuse. Now folks, in my opinion, this is why some of these really high wattage 12 volt inverters really are not that good of a choice, in my opinion, because 3000 watts takes so many amps to push through these cables. You're going to have to use 1/aught, 2/aught, 3/aught cables to be on the safe side, and that's really, really expensive. And the cables get hot, and it's just a lot of watts on a 12 volt system. If you're going to be running 3000 watts, I recommend going to a 24 volt system to cut those amps in half, which of course means you don't have to get such big cables, and it's just to me it's safer. But nonetheless, let's wrap up the testing on this inverter. So again, I've got my 1500 watt heater hooked up, I've got my little 500 watt heater hooked up, and I've got my incandescent light bulb array right up here off camera. So let's get this thing cut on again. And right off the bat, we are pulling around 2,000 watts. And we're up to 232 amps. Now, folks, all I'm going to say is this battery is rated at 100 amps. So the weak link in this whole entire setup is the battery, because it's hard to find a battery with a 250 amp BMS in this size. They do make some, but it's going to be a huge battery. But right now, I am dealing with a 100 amp BMS pulling. We've settled back down now to around 193 amps. 2,054 watts is what's showing on the inverter. The fans have kicked on. And that's how loud they are. So they are loud fans, but I would prefer my fans to be a little on the loud side and provide good airflow than have weak fans and not cool the inverter down properly. Now that's getting hot. Not the inverter, but the space heaters. But it's comfortably running over 2,000 watts. Okay, so I'm really just waiting on that BMS and the battery to die and cut this inverter off, but so far we're doing pretty well. Last test I want to do is to make sure that the watts showing up on this screen are close to the actual watts that actually are being used by one of these devices. So I've only got 3 ports here, so I'm going to actually measure this big 1,500 watt heater. And we got to do it upside down, it looks like, which is always fun. Try to get you a decent angle on the camera. Okay, so that watt meter is showing about 1,280 watts. And that's showing 1,336 watts. Remember, this is upside down. 1,264. 1,323. So I would not trust the watt output on that screen. If you're really concerned about it, I trust this watt meter more than I trust the screen on this inverter. But that is one downside to this that I have found. But let's get a voltage test on this thing one more time while we're here. 117 volts pulling around 1,300 watts. Actually, that's 119 volts now. That's kind of fluctuating, but a lot better than it being around 110 volts, which is what the previous model of this inverter was at. So that's good. So I am done running space heaters in this 100-degree garage, folks. But overall, I think it's a pretty good inverter for the price. It is a budget inverter. It's not one of your top-of-the-line, super expensive inverters. But if you need something to kickstart, say, an old refrigerator that does take quite a lot of input rush when the compressor kicks on, you are going to want something of this size, like a 3,000 watt. I don't recommend using this for continuously running 3,000 watts, but for any type of appliance that requires a really large initial rush of wattage to get that compressor started or something, these are good for that. Now, of course, you got to remember, you got to have a battery that's capable of that. You've got to have an inverter that's capable of that. And this inverter seems to be doing pretty well. The only downside that I have seen is the watt meter on the screen is a little bit off from the actual watt meter plugged into the side of it. So that's really the only downside that I have seen on this inverter so far. The fans are loud on the loud side, but again, it's got a lot of airflow coming in and out of this thing, so I'm okay with that. This isn't going to be put next to my bed. Guys, that's it for the AMPEAK 3000 watt inverter. I'll leave a link for this thing in the description if you want to check it out, because I know that they run sales on these all the time. So if you're interested, you know, check Amazon and see if they've got a current sale going. But other than that, folks, that's it. Take care.